Welcome to Mid-Century Living, your weekly podcast about everything mid-century and how to bring the mid-century vibe to your everyday life.
Welcome to Mid-Century Living, the show where we talk all about the mid-century then and now. We're your hosts, Jacky
And Gonzalo. So today we're going to cover sitcoms. But before we cue up the laugh track, if you are liking the podcast so far, please leave us a review on whatever platform you are using. This really helps us get on the listener lists. So let's get things rolling. But first, we haven't talked since last week, so what's new?
Nothing. I should have brought to this episode something about what's new this week.
I don't have anything new either for this week. So why don't we just jump into the topic then? Jacky, why don't you get us started?
So, we probably can't start talking about this topic without defining a sitcom. The sitcom official definition is a television series featuring a recurring cast of characters in comedic situations.
Yep. And sitcom is actually short for situation comedy, or a comedy in a situation, a term that was first coined by Variety. And it is a 30-minute format show featuring a continuing cast of characters, just like Jacky said. Very rarely changes. The characters are always the same setting, sometimes as far as wearing the same clothes, being the same age, being the same characters in the same town, even if a lot of time passes. For example, The Simpsons technically fall under a sitcom because in the last 30 years, they have not really changed much. And also, a laugh track is usually a feature of it.
So sitcoms originally got their start on radio, as most entertainment did, in the 1920s, and didn't start moving over to television until the 1940s. Although television technically started in the 30s, people still preferred listening to the radio for entertainment until after World War II.
So for more information on the background of sitcoms through history, there's a really cool documentary by CNN called The History of the Sitcom, which I think is available on Netflix, or was for a time. So the first sitcom on radio was Sam and Henry, which is the earliest example of radio syndication. So we can thank Worthington Miner, manager of program development at CBS back in 1949, for the sitcom. He was looking for content as TV became more popular and thought the 15-minute radio sitcom format might translate well to TV. And it actually did. So, for example, The Lone Ranger in 1949 and 1957, and the Jack Benny program in 1950.
So a couple more details about the Jack Benny program. It was on radio from 1935 to 1955, and it was mainly just kind of a sketch show at that point. Jack Benny was playing a caricature of himself and was the butt of all the jokes. They started transitioning into television in 1950, and basically is responsible for evolving into the domestic sitcom format we know and love today. At first, they just started redoing radio episodes, and it ran on television until 1965.
Wow. It's a long run, even for today's standard.
Yeah.
So along with Jack Benny program, the first TV sitcom, or what's considered the first TV sitcom ever, is actually from the BBC, which is in the UK, and it's called Pinwright's Progress, and it ran from 1946 through 1947. It's a show about Mr. J. Pinwright, the owner of the smallest multiple store in the world, which is English for chain store. And the first sitcom in the USA was Mary Kay and Johnny, which started in 1947, and it follows the tales of New York newlyweds.
And we'll talk a little bit more about them later.
Awesome.
So, two different television ages intersected during the mid-century. The first golden age of television is considered the years between 1947 and 1960, and the network era is between the 1950s and the 1980s, when the big three television networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, dominated American television. And most of the sitcoms, most of the landmark sitcoms, came about during both of these ages. The very first television sitcom in the US, as we mentioned earlier, was Mary Kay and Johnny. It debuted on a television network called the Dumont Television Network, which is no longer around. And because it's no longer around, we actually don't have a lot of these episodes anymore because they just destroyed all of the tape to recover the silver content of the film prints, which is bananas.
What?
And
That is
then,
crazy. We should keep this. We should keep stuff from olden times.
right? I don't. Yeah, anyway. And then whatever they had, the worst part is whatever they had left over after they recovered the silver content, they just threw it all out. So, a lot of this footage is lost. But it was noteworthy for several reasons. One, it was the first program to show a couple sharing a bed.
Huh. Sorry, I thought that was the Flintstones.
I actually thought that it was I Love Lucy, actually, but they had twin beds, so never mind. Anyway, another noteworthy first is that it is um, the first series to show a woman's pregnancy on television. Mary Kay became pregnant in 1948, and they tried to hide it, but they couldn't do so successfully, so they ended up just writing it into the show. Another thing that happened on I Love Lucy, actually, is that they wrote her pregnancy into the show. So it's interesting because a lot of firsts that show was credited with actually were Mary Kay and Johnny firsts, but maybe it doesn't get all the credit because all that footage is lost.
Interesting, but it is kind of cool. And I know I'm jumping to the legacy, but we still see all that happening today,
And then we get to I Love Lucy, which is in 1951.
which actually started in 1950. Well, the pre-production part started in 1950 when CBS executive Harry Ackerman asked Lucille Ball, who was the female lead of a radio program called My Favorite Husband, about creating a TV version of that show.
Yes, but in this version, Lucille Ball insisted that her real life husband would be involved before she'd even create the show. The initial pilot of it failed, and reviews suggested that they make the characters less like their real life selves and more like ordinary, relatable people, and that's how we got the version of the characters, the version of themselves as caricatures that we know and love today. The show was so popular that businesses closed early on Monday night so that employees could run home and watch TV, which I love.
That
Um,
doesn't happen anymore.
no. That's another thing about a great thing about the network era and those big three television networks that this we're starting to get into now with these sitcoms is that because there were only three channels, there were a lot more group moments where all of society was watching. They were watching one of three channels at any given point, so there was a lot more. Everyone's watching the exact same thing at the exact same time. In fact, later on, this sitcom's not in our time period, but it's famously known that the series finale of MASH was such a big deal that everyone waited to go to the bathroom until the end of this episode, and it shocked New York's sewer system because everyone ran to the bathroom at the exact same time after the show was over, and they all flushed their toilets at the same time. It was this big shock to the underground sewers in the city because everyone was watching television at the exact same time. So that's how big a deal sitcoms can impact society. I just think that is hysterical.
I just imagine like the phone call to the guy in charge of the sewer system and be like, so nothing's working. Why is nothing working? Is everybody oh sorry. Is everybody going to the bathroom sometime?
Yes. But anyway, back to I Love Lucy. So some noteworthy firsts that this show brought about is it popularized the multi-camera setup. A common myth, actually, is that Desi Arnaz invented the multi-camera setup, but they were just really the first show to popularize it. They were also the first to set the new standard format where the episodes all the plot of each episode goes together. So up until now, most sitcoms were kind of independent skits, and the plots didn't really carry through over multiple episodes, but in I Love Lucy they did. So after this, it actually became industry standard, and that's how sitcoms today still are.
Cool.
Another fun fact is that the show was so popular it never fell below third place in the Nielsen ratings ever. So another noteworthy early sitcom is The Honeymooners, which started in 1955. It was created by and starred Jackie Gleason, um, based on a recurring comedy sketch from his variety show. Actually, a lot of these early episodes were 10 minutes or less, um, because they were just little comedy sketches mainly. Like I Love Lucy, this followed two couples living in New York City and the various schemes in their day to day living. Some noteworthy firsts about this show were one, that it was the first popular show featuring blue collar characters. Most of the other sitcoms that were popular at the time were middle class characters. Ralph Gleason's character was a bus driver, and his best friend Ed was a sewer worker. And most of the show took place in their gritty, neglected Brooklyn apartment building. Another thing that was noteworthy about this show is that the characters were the inspiration for the characters in the Flintstones, which didn't come out till 1960. In fact, Ed, the best friend who became Barney Rubble later, is considered one of the 50 greatest sidekicks of all time, according to Entertainment Weekly. That 50 greatest sidekicks article is actually really fun to read, so I'll link it in the show notes. Another sitcom from this era with noteworthy firsts is Leave It to Beaver. Um, it was the first sitcom to be told from a child's point of view, which is important to me personally because one of my other favorite sitcoms ever is from the 90s, Boy Meets World, which is entirely a child's point of view until later. So I'm glad that we have Leave It to Beaver to thank for one of my favorite shows of all time. And another hilarious, noteworthy first is that Leave It to Beaver was the first U.S. network television program to show a toilet. So
Ooh,
more
scandalous.
toilet stories in the sitcom episode.
So we have another show that's important because it has a lot of noteworthy firsts that previously were unsuitable for TV, kind of like the toilet in Leave It to Beaver. But this show is technically outside of our years. It is All in the Family, which run from 1971 to 1979, produced by CBS. And kind of like The Honeymooners, it centers around the life of a working class couple, Archie Bunker and Edith, his wife, and their family. But it's important because it's the first show that showed depiction of issues previously considered unsuitable for US network TV comedy. And also, it's noteworthy because the set centered among their living room, which showed a like front view of Archie's and Edith's chairs, and those chairs are on display in Washington D.C. at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, and it's really cool because Edith's chair, it's a Martha Washington style chair with its back and seat upholstered in this velour fabric with a thistle motif and white satin weave ground. And it was likely made in the 1940s, which is actually in our years. Uh, Although its exact date and manufacturer are unknown, the chair was purchased for the show's production from a thrift store in Southern California and used until its final season when a reproduction chair was made and the actual chair was donated to the
That
Smithsonian.
is very cool.
So these were just a couple of sitcoms we have to thank for the format of a sitcom that we still use today. And a little bit about that is that they typically include some sort of dilemma that the characters have to resolve during each episode. And the typical runtime, about 30 minutes, is pretty interesting because we started with those 15-minute radio sitcoms and moved to a 30-minute format. Uh, and the advertising usually was limited to either before or and after the show or to breaks, which is the way we do it today. However, today that brings our half-hour program to about 22 minutes runtime. More on the format, all sitcoms tend to have at least four characters: the hero, the anti-hero, a love interest, and a buddy. And we've kind of covered those already without even knowing. Typical setting, home or workplace, and usually have an A and B storyline where A is the main plot of the sitcom and B is the secondary storyline. And depending on how many main characters we have, if we happen to have six or eight, because usually they're in pairs, we could have a C or a D storyline as well. But the typical format started in the mid century that is still through with us today includes multiple storylines, often have a teaser scene before the opening credits that is designed to get the audience hooked, laughing as they switch the channels. Which, do we even channel surf
No,
anymore?
but I remember channel
But
surfing.
yeah, fun times. Um, Another thing that was started in the mid-century that we still use today, that all sitcoms use today, is the static set, which is usually one space where the fourth wall is broken by the camera. So think of shows like I Love Lucy and Friends, where we are seeing their apartments and we are always seeing the same three walls of the apartment. Typically, the way that sitcoms work using the multiple camera that was used first with I Love Lucy is that they have a main set with side sets that are the ones that change. So, for example, if you watch Friends, Monica's apartment, and then Chandler and Joey's apartment with the hallway in the middle, those are the standard set. But things like the coffee house or Ross's apartment or Phoebe's apartment or any of those other sets are actually on the sides, and those get broken down and rebuilt as needed per shows. And then what happens is the audience will actually the bleachers, I guess you could call them, the
Hmm.
audience seats, those rotate to accommodate for the laugh tracks.
Very cool.
Yeah. In a past life when I was an architect, I took uh, a little class that was run by the guy who designed Will and Grace.
Really?
And yes, and he taught us that. That's what it was. Class was about. It was about designing for sitcoms.
That is very cool. Yeah, the multiple camera setup is super interesting, and I'm very grateful for these early sitcoms to create that for us. It's basically like filming for theater. Basically, the like all of the action is posed towards the cameras, which are where the audience is. So, um, actually, they often use theater experience actors and crew members for multi-camera setups specifically because it's so much like live theater when they're filming this sort of style. Um, just some noteworthy sitcoms that use the multiple camera setup: um, The Dick Van Dyke Show, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Friends, Seinfeld, Full House, Frasier, Two and a Half Men, The Big Bang Theory. All of these are multi-camera setup TV shows. The other way that they filmed sitcoms was a single camera method, which was not in front of a live audience, and typically, if you use one camera, you have to edit more, but because you're editing more, you can do things like shoot in multiple locations or use visual effects like magical appearances and disappearances. So some shows that use this were I Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched, where they have magic a lot, or some other shows even without magic that used it were Leave It to Beaver, Gilligan's Island, The Brady Bunch. Happy Days is interesting because they started as a single camera show, but then as they got more popular, switched to multi camera.
I mean, we also see sitcoms taking the effect on today's world because we quote them all the time. Even if you don't realize it, quoting them is something that happens a lot. Their phrases tend to stay in our minds and pop up at random times. I mean, how many times have you said, been talking and don't want to continue talking and just go, oh, yada, 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 which is actually something that came out of Seinfeld? Or how many times have you, well, I've tried it and it never works, but said like, how you doing in Friends?
I can never think of the word pivot without thinking about Friends, actually. So that's something that comes up all the time.
So So listeners, I know that if you listen to the Meet the Hosts episode, you learned that I'm a teacher. I'm also a coach, and I was having my athletes move some stuff out of the weight room, and it included a very large piece of equipment that they had to pivot through a door, and they're moving it, and I'm just in the background yelling, "Pivot, pivot," and no one laughed except for me, and I felt
Aw.
old. They've been known to influence our lives. I mean, how many people began drinking cosmopolitans after watching Sex and the
Mm-hmm.
City? And the future of sitcoms will probably remain the same. I mean, we've stood the test of time since mid-century through today with this format, and reruns and syndications keep it alive. Syndication happens after a sitcom has reached or aired 100 times, and reruns are responsible for allowing us to watch all these mid-century shows and shows that are made in maybe the 90s or later but are no longer on air. They let us watch them even through today.
Yes, and I've also compiled a list of where vintage sitcoms are streaming today. So if you want to watch some of these and some that we haven't even mentioned in this show, um, Amazon Prime has The Bob Newhart Show, The Brady Bunch, The Beverly Hillbillies, Petticoat Junction, The Jeffersons, The Donna Reed Show, and Father Knows Best. Hulu has MASH, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, I Love Lucy, Happy Days, The Addams Family, Lost in Space, and Adam 12. And the Roku channel has Father Knows Best, Dennis the Menace, Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, Leave It to Beaver, The Dick Van Dyke Show, Hazel, Green Acres, The Flying Nun, and My Favorite Martian. Just to name a few.
The Flying Nun.
Some of these are
I forgot.
70s or late 60s, but I think they all count, so I mentioned them all.
Well, I know what I'll be doing the rest
Right?
of the day today.
Yeah, so if you guys don't have anything to do this weekend, you can watch some old sitcoms, thanks to the internet,
After you listen
after
to
you
our
listen to
show.
our show. Hopefully, we inspired some of you. And with that, I think that our plane has landed.
I think so too. And since Jackie said the word plane, I think it's time for our etiquette segment.
Yay! So I actually found this week's etiquette tip. So this is the rules on glove wearing, put out by the leather glove producers of France in 1958.
Hold up. Was there an organization called the Leather Glove Producers of
Indeed,
France?
there is, or was. Someone will have to Google that for me to see if they're still around. I do not own this book, but some nice reporter at Click Americana put this list together, and I just find it fascinating, so I wanted to share it with everyone in the podcast today. So, one tip that they gave in general, before even when to wear them, is that if you don't wear gloves every time you go out, you're more likely to feel self conscious on the few occasions that you wear them. And, quote, self consciousness about your clothes and accessories is a real poise destroyer. So the first rule is if you would handle yourself gracefully when wearing gloves is to make them a habit. Then you won't feel there's anything different about yourself when you have them on. So I thought that was funny advice. If you feel uncomfortable in gloves, just wear them more. But anyway, when you keep them on, it's basically always. So you don't carry your gloves, you wear your gloves. You put them on before you leave the house, you put them on at the restaurant table, at your seat in the theater, you just always wear your gloves. You leave them on to shake hands, regardless of if you're shaking hands with a man or a woman. But you do remove them when shaking hands with the head of state or church. You can even keep them on while dancing, unless they're very uncomfortable to do that. Keeping them on while dancing is actually an optional etiquette tip. You keep them on at a cocktail party or at a tea, unless you're going to eat. The main rule of glove wearing is that you never wear gloves while holding food. So you can hold a cocktail or a teacup with a gloved hand, but you cannot pick up food while wearing gloves. So you remove both gloves completely when sitting down to dinner or helping yourself at a buffet table. If you're at a cocktail party or a situation where you're standing and mingling, you can remove one glove and hold it in your left hand or leave it in your bag, which is near you, and use your ungloved right hand to hold the food and leave your left hand gloved. And the best rule of thumb is that if
Interesting.
other people have taken off their gloves, you also take off your gloves. So, what do we think?
Are these like the elbow length
They
gloves
can be.
that?
This is the rule for all gloves, be them wrist length or opera length gloves. All the way up to your elbows is opera length. So even if you're at an elegant party
Okay.
or at the opera and your gloves go up to your elbows, if you're grabbing food, you have to take that glove off.
Okay. So I'm conflicted then with my quote approval or disapproval of this because I have a really nice pair of leather gloves that were my grandfather's that I love to wear and I don't get to wear often. So I like the idea of there being a reason to wear them all the time. But I don't know. I can't do gloves very well. I There's this saying in Spanish that is, if I translate it, cat wearing gloves catches no mice. So I don't like wearing gloves because I feel like I can't do whatever activity. So if there's a rule that says that I need to keep them on, then it's gonna have to be a no from me.
Well, I'm glad that you said that. This is actually rules I should have clarified at the beginning about women wearing gloves. I believe that the etiquette for
Oh,
men is the same as with hats, where you wear your gloves and your hats out in public, and then when you come inside, you take them off. Women wear
okay,
gloves all the time. In you don't have to. Women don't have to take off their gloves or their hats upon entering a building. Men do though.
okay,
So you, by the time you get to the food, already have your gloves off. That's fine.
okay. Well, then I think I'll let you give the stamp or not give the stamp because it seems that I have the better end without having to wear gloves in formal occasions.
So I think if you've gone through the trouble of wearing gloves at all for a formal event, I appreciate knowing that you can keep them on as long as possible and that you're not bound by etiquette to leave them on while you're eating food so that you don't ruin them. So I think that these are acceptable etiquette rules for a situation where you're wearing gloves. So I say approve.
Sounds good. All right, guys. So it looks like we've reached the end of our episode today. So thank you guys again for listening to us talk about sitcoms, and hopefully we've inspired you guys to check out some of those streaming services with mid-century sitcoms. Make sure you guys follow us and subscribe to us on all our platforms, and send us an email at info.mcliving@gmail.com along with feature show ideas, comments, questions, and make sure you write a review for our podcasts. It lets us know how we're doing, but also helps us stand out in the world of podcasting. And with that, we'll see you guys next week.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Mid-Century Living. Please subscribe, tell your friends, and leave a review. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at MCL Podcast. See you next Friday.